I'd like to start the conversation with a specific glass plate. This artifact is one of the first recorded photographs by the Taiwan Forestry Research Institute and shows the complexity and hybridity of Taiwan's recent history. Within the photo, first, we have the surrounding figures of the unknown indigenous tribe wrapped in cloaks, either intentionally or unintentionally blurred on the perimeter of the photograph. Either way, it reveals the importance of the photographic technology and its capabilities at the time. Next, at the center of the photograph, we have the British plant collector and explorer E.H. Wilson, who helps date this glass plate to around 1917 to 1918. Surrounding Wilson, we have what appears as Japanese soldiers at first glance, but then, based on further research, come to find out that they're botanists in government-issued uniforms by the Japanese government. Notably to Wilson's right, we have Ryozo Kanehira, Japanese botanist and explorer, who is seen with a slight smile in this photo, and many like it, and his left arm on the unknown tribesman. Kanehira spent his time of research first importing tropical plants in Taiwan, working with Hayata, and later on in his career, focusing on the indigenous plants and working with native tribes. There are currently 16 nationally recognized tribes in Taiwan, with others fighting for regional or national recognition to this day. This recognition specifically is difficult for some of the tribes and their populations, as they've been impacted by colonialism as well as generational sinicization, therefore not being able to distinguish themselves through a purity test that's been set by others. The importance of these glass plates of the plants as well as the indigenous tribes is not necessarily the gaze or the gaze back or the technology alone, but the ever-changing relationship between them and how we perceive them. Or as Karen Barad puts it, intra-action. As Barad writes, intra-action acknowledges the impossibility of an absolute separation or classical understood objectivity, in which an apparatus or a person using an apparatus are not considered to be a part of the process that allows for specifically located outcomes or measurement. These social and technological outcomes, or moments, capture the relationship between the landscape and humans. And albeit entangled in that moment at first glance, can actually become a central force of how people in a place can find legitimacy today through a feedback loop with these archival objects. In other words, with the intentional centering of plants or the figures in these photos, we can actually bring into question of who is the expert today rather than what was orchestrated at that time. In 2017, my collaborator Mitsu Salmon and I were invited for an artist residency in Mado, which is on the outskirts of Tainan, Taiwan. Situated on top of an old Meiji Sugar Company factory, this current residency covers both old factory and colonial period Japanese residential headquarters. Specifically to us, the company's chief residence is where we operated out of, which is surrounded by imported and indigenous plants, some of which Kanehira named, and is a small museum made out of cypress wood. Cypress wood was once in abundance in Taiwan, but is now protected by the Taiwanese government, given the fact that it was a fundamental building material of Japanese architecture, both in Taiwan as well as what was exported to Kyoto at the time. The architecture of this house and surrounding buildings can be connected to the experimentation conducted by the Japanese in Taiwan during the colonial period of 1895 to 1945. During the Japanese occupation, Japanese architects would travel to Taiwan to experiment in building materials and methods, as they had more freedom to do so there than they would in Japan. However, the compelling experimentation today is not the material or the washitsu-style room reverberating in Mandarin, but the tone of hybridity of the imported and native plants influencing the structure from the outside. The imported trees speak to the past inhabitants, such as Kanahira, and the indigenous trees and their aerial roots speak to the folklore that goes further back, connected to the indigenous tribes, such as the Shirayan tribe nearby. One example of this is the aerial roots are expansive and have stories connected to them, such as the gods being able to descend down the roots from heaven to earth. During our 3-month residency, we were fortunate enough to meet with numerous local individuals who shed light on the perspectives of our project. This redefined our understanding of architecture in Taiwan and how the play with space can be interpreted in such various hybrid methods. One specific example of this is working with architecture professors who plant trees with communities as a large part of their research. This act of planting trees is based on economic development, such as selling the fruits that the trees give, water absorption being a preventive process for flooding in the neighborhood, as well as in certain circumstances, air filtration in highly polluted areas. This is not necessarily large A agriculture, but small-scale farming that the community can actually surround itself with. Or as Eric Kleinberg puts it, social infrastructure. As he says, when social infrastructure is robust, it fosters contact, mutual support, and collaboration among friends and neighbors. When degraded, it inhibits social activity, leaving families and individuals to fend for themselves. These concepts and experiences were then brought back to the chief's residence, where the trees were treated as part of the same built structure. Through various tests at the site and specific to the materials of the building itself, as well as hosting community workshops, the interiority and exterior of the chief's residence metaphorically collapsed. Therefore, the hybridity of Taiwan's architecture specifically shows us the level of experimentation and openness to nature that allows for us to actually be able to reconsider it today. Building on this sense of history and hybridity, for the Taipei Artist Village residency in 2018, we were given the opportunity to create a collapsed sense of history in the gallery. In other words, a century under an hour. The natural direction given our backgrounds was plants and sounds in a scenario that mimics what we've come across. This was not necessarily to highlight tools used by botanists in the 20th century, but also the ghost tones of personal stories associated with Kanahira, a social hinge to the tools from the past presented in the speculative future. Furthermore, working with the Taipei Botanical Gardens, which is an off-branch of the Taiwan Forestry Research Institute, started in 1895, the collapsed gallery space proposed nature as an open space to history and not necessarily a part of its past. A space one feels suspended in to reevaluate the relationship between history and nature, with cultural implications in mind, or as Elizabeth Grosz states on nature and architecture, rather than seeing it as an either fixed origin, given limit, or predetermined goal, nature, the natural, must be seen as the site and locus of impetus and force, the ground of a malleable materiality, whose plasticity and openness accounts for the rich variability of cultural life and the various subversions of cultural life that continue to enrich it. The natural must be understood as fundamentally open to history, to transformation, or to becoming as open as cultural, as innovative, temporal, and historical as the purview of social, psychical, and cultural. Therefore, in this installation, nature and architecture are represented in another collapsed space in our practice, where plants imported into the gallery and virtuality are indecipherable, where botanical tools and plants' agency were not based on their physical permanence, but the virtual entanglements with history, current inhabitants, and potentiality for the future. Looking at the silhouettes of the imported plants, The backdrops mimicked the colors of lush green of Taiwan, the more personal poetic colors related to Kanahira's family and orchids, and specific events such as the Great Fires at Yangmingshan in the 20th and 21st century. Specifically on the aspect of sound and architecture, electronic bird circuits that were used during our residency in Mado helped find the reflective surfaces of the gallery walls in this scenario. The intriguing aspect of the circuits themselves was not the electronic biomimicry in the sound, but the rhythms that helped define the surfaces of the space. Furthermore, to give more agency to the plants, inductors and radios in this space brought plants alive with feedback loops of microvoltage from the plants extracted and transmitted to high-gain amplifiers to power both lights as well as noise over short-range radio. So let us finish where we started, southern Taiwan, specifically Mado. In the winter of 2019, we were able to return to the old Meiji sugar factory for an art triennial. Our main objective was to readdress the hybridity we had come across in the context of botany and architecture through a more informed lens. Aside from looking at built structures, we wanted to inspect the land more numerically, where data could be acquired from the soil itself to show us what made this space specifically fertile for a sugar factory. On a more poetic layer, how do we ephemerally measure the land? How do we respond as visitors again? How do we on the X and Y axes balance nature and built structures?
But during their time, I think, during especially the nighttime.
Aside from observational work and movement pieces created for the festival, we wanted to further develop the sensors that we had worked with at the Lincoln Park Conservatory. These were to be developed further in conversations and experiments with the Shirayan tribe leaders at first, as a form of social design, as Ezio Manzini puts it. The Shirayan tribe, given the level of sinicization that has happened to their population, is still attempting to get national recognition as an indigenous tribe. The sinicization has to do with the fact that they have always lived in the valley, not the mountainside. The idea of integrating the sensors themselves started by recording their oral history as well as their musical instruments such as the nose flute in casual conversations, which we wanted to further explore through an automated process or data-driven form. Specifically, in this instance, data-driven from the landscape that they were from to activate sounds. Therefore, the soil sensors here were developed that could drive the music samples in Max MSP, which is a graphical user interface patching software. In other words, we wanted to connect oral history to the land, specifically. Land is a large marker of agency and validity in Taiwan, specifically to the indigenous tribes, both either being recognized or not. Land is a form of territory in terms of physical as well as social. We wanted to develop these sensors further. And thanks to the professors that we had worked with in the past planting trees, specifically Hengyi Chen, we were able to connect with the Rukai tribe. This tribe is situated in the Pingtung area of southern Taiwan and is often miscategorized as the Paiwan tribe given their close proximity in the mountains. The Rukai tribe also is allotted a certain amount of land by the Taiwanese government for farming, but this land is remote from where they currently live. Therefore, the land and its actual upkeep is at times hard given the physical distance and commute that one has to take to check on the land itself. Therefore, the sensors were to be a tool of checking your land remotely. Furthermore, in this iteration of the sensor, we integrated solar cells to power the sensors themselves. Given the fact that we're primarily looking at soil moisture, the solar aspect of these became a sensor of its own, meaning that when the land was dry, the sensor was working and functioning and therefore alerting the farmer. But if a rainstorm was passing through, there's the chance that the solar panels would be turning off, and therefore, given the rain volume, the sensor would not be needed. We were fortunate enough to install the initial cellular solar version of this sensor on the property of the mayor of the Rukai tribe. This sensor he could check remotely during any meeting or anything on any of his devices or on his computer. Appropriately, we named the sensor Saobao, which is a greeting in the Rukai language. This naming speaks to the larger goals we have in Taiwan, which is to create socio-technological tools to take back to the communities that have been in Taiwan and could benefit from them. Not benefit from them in the capitalistic sense, but to regain territory that they've inhabited. As you can see in this photo, we were also fortunate enough to plant a tree on the mayor's land that is named after Ryozo Kanehira. And my collaborator, who is planting the tree in the photo, has a slight smile similar to her great-grandfather. Which brings us back to how we started this conversation, by examining a photo and the characters within it. But rather than ending with a closing statement, I'd like to ask some questions. How do you design for a complex legacy? Can it be translated from one place to another? What are the roles of socio-technological tools between nature and history? What is the role of the creator, designer, architect in an intervention where a feedback loop brings legitimacy to the group in need rather than the intellectual property holder?